Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello there and good afternoon. The number of police officers in England and Wales has fallen to its lowest level in more than 30 years.
That's right. The new figures would seem to support forces' concerns over their capacity to tackle the likes of terror threats and online fraud. Well, separate data also shows rising levels of violence and theft have contributed to the largest annual increase in crime for a decade.
Let's have a look at the data and those statistics. Official figures show that there were just over 123,000 officers across all ranks in England and Wales at the end of March of this year.
Well, that's some 862 fewer officers compared to last year and the lowest number since comparable records began at 21 years ago. Although a Home Office report said records indicate that these could actually be the lowest figure since 1985.
Well, it comes as statistics from the Office for National Statistics show in 2017 there's been a 10% increase in recorded crime compared to last year. That is the largest single rise in a decade.
OK, well, let's speak to our reporter, Olivia Kingsley. She's been going through all of these figures. And, Olivia, I have to say, really worrying stuff.
Well, yes, as you say, these figures have come from the Home Office just this morning. So recent figures, the most recent figures we've got. And they're only going to serve to back up calls from police officers who are saying that they are under pressure. We've got senior figures within the police force saying this as well, that they are under-resourced, under pressure. And we've seen examples of those pressure recently in London and, of course, in Manchester. We've had the Westminster Bridge attack. We've had the London Bridge attack. We've recently then had Grenfell piling on even more pressure, particularly on Metropolitan Police. Up in Manchester, the police had to respond there to an awful attack. And we've also had in just the last week reports that officers have actually been asked to return to work because one of the largest force in the country is actually facing such pressure on its detective capacity that it can't cope. We spoke to the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott, and this is what she had to say.
The rising crime figures is very alarming, but it reflects what we're hearing in communities and what the Police Federation is seeing. With the fall in police numbers, we're seeing rising levels of crime. We're aware that in our big cities like London and Liverpool, we are seeing rising levels of gun crime, knife crime and violent crime, like the recent spate of throwing acid in people's faces. And it is that violent crime and gang crime that causes most fear in communities. So the government is wrong to dismiss the police reporting figures. They need to address what people are concerned about, and they need to address rising levels of violent crime.
So we've got Diane Abbott, they're talking about rising crime numbers, which have also had those statistics today from the Office of National Statistics. Of course, funding has been something that's been talked about for many years. We've had funding cuts in all areas, including in the police. And we've seen Theresa May under a lot of pressure recently, Brexit, and also within her own party, within her cabinet. And of course, she was a Home Secretary when a lot of these cuts have been implemented. And we could now see her come, I think, under fresh pressure over these police figures too.
OK, Olivia, thanks very much.
Two important figures released today in the area of crime. One concerns the number of police officers. That's at a 30-year low. And also separately, on the same day, figures from the Office for National Statistics showing some pretty alarming increases in different types of crime. Who better to turn to than the Policing Minister, Nick Hurd, who's in Westminster. Mr Hurd, a very good afternoon to you. 10% overall, over a 12-month period, the increase in crime. And to pick out a couple of specific examples, the use of handguns in firearms offences rose 24%. What on earth's going on?
Let's be clear to your viewers, because it's important to understand this, that we're digesting two different sources of information today. The first are the official statistics, the National Crime Survey that's been running for many years that asks people about their experiences of crime. The second, which you're referring to, is the data that records the recording of crime by police. Now, they tell different stories and a mixture of good news and bad news.
Both, don't we, Minister? We do routinely quote both.
Yes or no? It is a bit confusing, and I think it's important for viewers to understand what's going on because it matters to them. So, the message from the official statistics, the National Crime Survey, that's run for many years now, is actually very encouraging. Is that overall crime down 7% year on year, down 38% since 2010, down 69% since the peak of 1995. I think all of us can welcome that. Yeah. Within the recorded crime numbers, which you're primarily referring to, again, it's not all bad news in the sense that it's good news that the police are getting better at recording crime. That's been a problem in the past. It's also good news that in some very sensitive areas, such as domestic abuse and sexual assault, people feel more confident to come forward. That's
you're attributing people coming forward for the 14% rise in sexual offences?
No, I'm not attributing anything. The ONS themselves are quite clear, the statisticians, that some of this increase represents better recording of crime. I'm not dodging for 1 minute the truth that they recognise that within these numbers there is evidence of some real growth in some worrying crimes, particularly around violent crime, knife and gun. So I'm not ducking that for 1 minute, but the context is important. So crime is falling, but crime is changing, and there are some worrying trends which we are determined to stay absolutely on top of. So knife crime, I'm a London MP, this is an issue I'm very aware of. We're being very proactive in terms of more effective police enforcement. A recent operation seized 1,200 knives, led to 300 arrests. We've got tougher laws for buying of knives.
Just on knife crime, Minister, you are sticking with the current intelligence-led approach rather than going back to stop and search.
Our view on stop and search hasn't saved. It has its place, but it needs to be used in the most appropriate way. Our approach is based on even better police enforcement, and we're seeing the evidence of that already. Tougher laws around possession, tougher laws to make it harder, even harder for particularly young people to buy knives, and really effective partnership working with community partners to do even more to try and tackle the cultural issues here, so that young people think a lot harder about carrying and using knives.
But we've been struck down the years, really since 2010, by the perversity really of the statistics, the breakage between cause and effect. You know, police numbers have been going down, and surprisingly, perhaps, or counterintuitively, crime's been going down as well. So there isn't necessarily a link. I'm not asking you to make it between declining resources and rising crime. But what people will be really struck by in the official police figures today is the sheer sharpness of the turn. I mean, overall 10% up, but I repeat to you, knife and gun crime in the space of a year has risen by 1/5. Now that will really, really worry people beyond the usual froth that sometimes surrounds these figures. That's a really big jump.
Yes, and I share that concern, but I don't want to be too pedantic about it. But people need to your viewers need to understand that some of that increase is simply an increase in the recording of a crime, and some of it may even reflect better operational enforcement. I mentioned that operation that led to 300 arrests in 1 week, but I'm not disguising the fact and our concern about evidence of real growth in some alarming crime in some parts of the country. What I'm trying to do, Colin, is give some assurance to your viewers that we've been aware of this for some time, and we're on it in terms of trying to stay on top of emerging crime. Crime is falling, but crime is changing. And our number one responsibility to the public is safety, and making sure that we have the strategies in place and that the police have the resources they need to keep our communities safe and to deliver policing to the standard we all want.
And you pose your own question there, don't you, by asking whether the police have the resources that they feel they need. People will take your point that crime generally may be falling overall, but they'll look at a 16% rise in robbery, for instance, and wonder whether police on the ground have the officers that they need, both in terms of intelligence gathering, but actually stopping crimes happening. And I say that, for instance, in the context of stories this week looking at moped crime, people, muggers effectively snatching mobile phones from people, a spate of those types of crimes, operational guidelines changing to stop police actually pursuing criminals like that. At the sharp end, people make the connection between falling resources, fewer officers, and rising crime.
Okay, well, let me address that. Let me address specifically the issue of resources. So these are the facts. We will be spending this financial year approximately £8.5 billion worth of the public's money on policing. In that process, we don't expect any police force to get less than flat cash in this process if their police and crime commissioners have used their powers to raise funds through their local precepts. At this moment in time also, our police system is sitting, the last numbers I saw, on around about £1.8 billion worth of public money in reserve, some of it allocated, some of it unallocated. So those are the finances at the moment. But what we hear very clearly from all levels of the police is a very clear message about, look, we feel very stretched, we feel very strained, in part perhaps because of the terrorism instance we've had to cope with, but also because the pattern of change, crime is changing, becoming more complex. So that message we have to listen to, because our primary responsibility is the safety of the public. So over the next few months, we will be engaging very closely with the police, force by force, to really drill down into the pressures they're under, the demand they're under, their own strategies to manage that, their own strategies in relation to efficiency, because there's still more to do there, their own strategies in relation to reserves policy, so that the Home Secretary and I, later this year, can make decisions based on better evidence than we've got at the moment. We know what our responsibilities are, is to make sure that the police have the resources they need to keep our communities safe and to deliver the kind of standard of policing that we all want.
Nick Hurd, got to leave it there. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
On the fall in the number of police officers in England and Wales, new figures show levels have dropped to the lowest in more than 30 years. It comes as separate data shows the largest annual increase in recorded crime for a decade. Steve White is chair of the Police Federation of England and Wales, which represents frontline officers. Hi, thanks for joining us. How bad is it?
Well, it's as bad as the figures clearly demonstrate. What I find particularly frustrating is that this is what we've been talking about for the last 3 to 4 years, that exactly this scenario was going to happen. We've got no resilience in the police service. We've lost 21,500 police officers, and at the same time, crime is now creeping up through the roof. A 10% overall increase in crime. We've seen increases in violent crime and traditional crime types in terms of burglary, robbery, the kind of crime that affects many, many people every single day, and something has got to give, and the government needs to wake up.
We need to take those two things separately there, don't we? There has been a reduction in the police numbers, as you say, by a significant amount, tens of thousands. But as far as the crime rate is concerned, it's being calculated differently, which is why the number has gone up so significantly. No,
I disagree. We've been doing...
So the crime rate's gone up because of inclusion of fraud and cybercrime, is that not right?
Well, that is recorded separately. 5.2 million offences in relation to fraud and cybercrime, which aren't included in the headline figures of the 10% rise, which is bizarre, I have to accept. Because it should be. The 10% is about the traditional crime types that we've always recorded. Now, some commentators will say it's because of the change in the way that the police service has recorded it. Well, we've changed the way we've been recording crime 15 years ago, so I think that excuse is done and dusted. And commentators are now saying, as we have been saying, this is a very real rise in crime. And it is clearly connected with the decrease in resources to the police service.
OK, so when we hear from David Davis, he says crime's down 30% in the 6 years since when Theresa May was the Home Secretary. He's using the figures from the crime survey for England and Wales. Face-to-face survey, 38,000 adults and children which are asked about their experiences of crime in the previous year. Until 2016, the survey did not include fraud and cybercrime. Which bit of that's incorrect?
Well, the British Crime Survey also doesn't include some violent crime types that we've seen go through the roof. Murder, for example, and it is just a survey. What the crime figures demonstrate, the ONS figures, is real recorded crime, real victims and real issues that the police have to deal with. It's not some make-believe figure, it's the reality. And actually, as we've seen across the country, police stations have been closed. The ability for members of the public to even report crime to the police is very, very challenging. And I believe this is the tip of the iceberg.
So police are being stretched to their limit. They're being asked to work 16 days straight, and then we see a terror attack and then another terror attack, and then we saw Grenfell, and officers are basically on their knees. What needs to be done? What can be done short term?
Well, the government has got to give a commitment to greater investment. There's got to be long-term planning about how that investment can then be used. Well, in the short term, the ship has sailed on that. It should have been done 3 years ago, which is what we've been saying.
How dangerous is it? I'm going to use the word dangerous. How dangerous is it at the moment not having the right levels of policing, and the officers that we do have on duty are so tired that they are, as I said, basically on their knees?
The British Police Service is a can-do service. We'll always go the extra mile, but it's the resilience that's the issue. The government now needs to look carefully at what the police service needs to provide, how much they're prepared to spend, and what the public want from their police service. That's what's got to happen. We've been warning about this for many, many years. years. And OK, we can keep saying, I hate to tell you, we told you so, but we told you so. What is important now, and I think this is the point that you're asking me, is, OK, what are we going to do? We've got a budget statement coming up in the autumn. The government has got to commit, not just turn around and say that it's protecting police funding, it's got to increase police funding so that chief constables and police and crime commissioners can start to plan long term to fill those gaps. We aren't going to be able to do it overnight. If we start recruiting now, it's going to be 2 to 3 years before that comes online. But it's essential that we take action now.
So if there is another terror attack, God forbid, or another Grenfell-style incident, where does that leave the police service?
The service will have to prioritise, which is what we've always had to do. And of course, we've got to deal with the immediacy of issues. But of course, the primary purpose of policing is to prevent crime in the first place. And that's the bit that's missing. That neighbourhood policing, that contact, to make sure that the youth don't carry knives in the first place, to make sure that, that local people aren't radicalised. That's what we've got to get back to doing. It's what we used to do. And of course, now we've got figures that show we've got lower numbers of police officers for over 30 years. Something has got to give.
Good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Thank you. Return to those police numbers. New figures show levels of policing in England and Wales have fallen to the lowest in more than 30 years. It comes as separate data shows the largest annual increase in crime for a decade. From central London, joined by Lord Paddock, former Deputy Assistant Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, and Peter Kirkham, Senior Investigating Officer. Hello to you, gentlemen. Thank you both for joining us. Lord Paddock, to you first of all. How have we found ourselves in this state?
Well, unfortunately, whilst some crime has been going down, the crime that causes most concern amongst the public, violent crime, crime that happens on the streets, whether it's knife crime, street robbery or gun crime, those have been going up. And these are not simply recording issues. These are real increases in the crimes that cause the public most fear. And I think it's because the police are vacating these public spaces. 20,000 less police officers, 22,000 less support staff, including uniformed police community support officers, means that there simply isn't the uniform presence, a deterrence and a reassurance to the public on the streets anymore.
Peter Kirkham, every time I speak to someone from the government, they tell me that there are more armed police officers than ever before, and that is reflecting the changing nature of what we want from our police force.
It's also a lie. There were 7,000 armed officers, approximately 7,000 armed officers in England and Wales in 2010. It dropped to about 5,600. It's now back up a bit, but we're still about 500 short of where we were. So to claim we've got more armed officers than ever before is simply a lie. It's also a lie to claim that crime is down and police reform is working. Frankly, crime is up and police reform is an unmitigated disaster. There is a crisis in policing that is deepening by the day. It's not just about crime. Crime is about 30–40% of the police's role. There are missing persons, traffic accidents, you name it, they do it. They're picking up work as a result of failure of other agencies that have been cut, such as mental health, national health services, such as children's services. And as Brian has identified, there is no police presence in public space. The thugs have noticed that. They have reacted. We have got a knife crime epidemic, a moped crime epidemic. We're starting to see acid being used in street crime for the first time in my knowledge. Basically, this crisis in policing is deepening by the day. Officers are going sick with stress. Officers are leaving in their droves. The government must act. They are being negligent with public safety. It is as simple as that.
Lord Paddock, David Davis saying that crime is down 35% in the 6 years that Theresa May was the Home Secretary.
Well, you know, we have seen a reduction, as I say, in some kinds of crime. They keep quoting the crime survey. The crime survey is a relatively small survey of the public compared with the numbers of the total population. And so when it comes to crimes which are relatively small compared with the overall number of crimes, like street robbery, like knife crime, like gun crime, they're not really picked up by this survey. And so whilst some crimes are falling. As I say, the crimes of most concern are increasing. And if you look at the crime survey, now almost 50% of that crime is cybercrime and online fraud. Now, that wasn't measured before. So when the government say, oh, well, the crime survey data shows a 7% reduction in crime, that does not include online crime and online fraud, which is significantly increasing. Whichever way you look at it, the number of crimes being reported to the police are significantly increasing. The number of police officers who are there to report and investigate those crimes is down considerably. That means victims are not going to get the service they deserve from their police.
OK, stand by, guys, if you would, because just want to hear what the policing minister had to say earlier on to us.
What we hear very clearly from all levels of the police is a very clear message about, look, we feel very stretched, we feel very strained, in part perhaps because of the terrorism instance we've had to cope with, but also because the pattern of change, crime is changing, becoming more complex. So that message we have to listen to, because our primary responsibility is the safety of the public. So over the next few months, we will be engaging very closely with the police, force by force, to really drill down into the pressures they're under, the demand they're under, their own strategies to manage that, their own strategies in relation to efficiency, because there's still more to do there, their own strategies in relation to reserves policy, so that the Home Secretary and I, later this year, can make decisions based on better evidence than we've got at the moment.
Heartened at all, Peter Kirkham?
Nick Hurd needs to do one of two things tomorrow. Either tell the police stop doing some of the big pile of work they've got to do, or to stop doing it as thoroughly, to free up resources, or to wave a magic police officer tree and reinstate lots of the cut officers. He obviously can't do the latter. If they turn that around tomorrow, it'll take years to work through. We've been accused of crying wolf for some time. Well, wolf, it's happened, it's here, there's a wolf at the door. We've told them it's coming. They have ignored us. The government has flatly refused to listen to professional police officers. I've got 2 first degrees and 2 master's degrees. I know what statistics and crime surveys and everything else are all about. Yes, the crime survey for England and Wales is fantastic for what it is, but for instance, it doesn't include crime affecting people below 16. It doesn't include lots of the categories of crime that are rising. The big problem is we have lost control of public space, and police officers need to be put back there. Okay. Amber Rudd tomorrow could make a clear and unambiguous statement of support for the police to robustly use the powers they have got.
Okay.
That's
okay,
not
Lord
been
Paddock, young people listening to what we are saying this afternoon, why on earth would they want to join the police force?
Well, I mean, it is, despite the significant reduction in the starting salary, the devastating effect that it's had on officers who've served 20 years already, to being told they don't have to do another 10 years before they get their pension, they're going to have to do another 20 years, and even then it's going to be less of a pension than they were promised when they started. Despite all of that, it is a great career. It is about caring and looking after people. But you certainly don't go into policing to make lots of money, that's for sure.
Peter Kirkham, would you join the police force again?
It's a fantastic job. It remains a fantastic job. It will always be a fantastic job. I would say it's the best job in the world. But at the moment, the organisational context and the political context is utterly dysfunctional. It needs to be addressed. Public safety is at risk.
OK, good to talk to both of you. Thank you for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Thank you. More now on the fall in the number of police officers in England and Wales. New figures show levels have dropped to the lowest in more than 30 years. It comes as separate data shows the largest annual increase in recorded crime for a decade. Speak to our police analyst, Graham Wetton, who is here with us, recently written a book about being a member of the police service. Would you still be a police officer today if you were about to join?
Yes, I would. Yeah, I'd still advocate as a career, but there are significant demands now on policing because the numbers are less. The numbers are reduced. Demand has significantly increased. The numbers are now lower, or as low as they were in the mid-80s, 1985, I think the figure was given. That's when I was policing and an operational officer. Yet the demands are significantly more. We didn't have the internet then. We had no mobile phones. Crime and the impact of crime has significantly increased. Yet police numbers over the last few years have been gradually being reduced by the government policies. So
what the government is saying is that because the way that we need to police our country has changed, we don't need as many police officers. Yeah, strange. The argument seemed to be when they started these cuts was that less crime equals less police officers. Yet now we're seeing
figures out today, there is now more crime. So it'd be interesting to see whether that same argument holds water. More crime should mean more police officers. The police are becoming a less effective deterrent to crime because there's less visible officers on the street, so there's less deterrent. If people are seeing less officers, the opportunity to commit crime increases. That's why we're seeing an increase in crime.
And again, what the government is saying, in the form of David Davis, he's saying that figures have gone down something like, crime figures have gone down something like 35% when Theresa May was Home Secretary. And actually, statistics can lie. And the reason that it looks as though the figures have gone up is with things like cybercrime.
Yeah, it is, and that's one factor that has been added in, but that still needs reporting and investigating. So you still need police officers to carry out that fundamental role. They're becoming almost just a reporting process, reporting crime, as opposed to preventing it and then detecting it and apprehending people committing crime. They're just becoming a reporting function where we're reporting and recording crimes taking place. And that needs to change. Are we at crisis level? Yeah, very so. I think so, very much so. You speak to officers on the street, they are literally chasing themselves around the street, reporting crime, just reporting it as it happens. There's very little prevention, a bit of detection going on, but very little preventive policing going on. Proactive policing, it used to be called when I was out there. There's very little actual proactive policing going on. They're going from one call to the other and just reporting it. That's becoming a crisis. The numbers are becoming a crisis. The effect on officers, the stress on them, the mental health aspects to officers being constantly under pressure. We've seen in London alone, the terror attacks recently and up in Manchester. The impact on officers is increasing daily. There are more officers going off sick with stress now and mental health issues than ever before. That has to be because of the demands on them and the lower numbers of officers to deal with it.
Is there a short-term fix? Obviously, what some of your colleagues have been saying to us today is that long-term we need to get more police officers on the street. Of course we do, given what we're hearing at the moment. But short-term, what can be done?
Well, no, short-term, the Metropolitan Police have actually put out a letter asking for ex-officers to come back. If you're retired, I think it's within the last 5 years, which rules me out, if you're retired in the last 5 years, they would like you to go back and help them. They are seeing unprecedented levels of demand on the service, lower numbers, more officers off sick, they need more police officers. Short-term, the government and the police service need to do something about getting more people into policing. And longer-term, greater funding, more resources take us back up to levels we had a few years ago when we were effectively dealing with crime.
OK, it's always good to see you, Graham. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
The drop in crime over the last 20 years may be at an end. Compiling reliable figures is complex, but there's been a big increase in recorded crime in England and Wales. The number of offences rose by 10% in the year to March, the largest annual rise in a decade. Violent offences increased by 18%. There was also more robbery and car crime. Domestic burglary cases were up by 6%. Part of the increase can be explained by better recording of crime. But as our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford reports, government experts are convinced now the overall trend is on the rise.
Jamel Boyce, who in the few minutes of a frenzied knife attack in South London last October, was left in hospital, blinded and with permanent brain damage. A victim of what appears to be rising violence in England and Wales, particularly in our cities.
I see him every day. It's like every day I go to see him, it's like I'm going to a funeral every day. That's not Jamel. That's not how I know Jamel. That's not how I want to remember Jamel. And it tears me up. It rips me up every day I see him.
Today's 18% increase in violence is based on the crimes actually recorded by police, like this stabbing in Manchester in January. It's been an unreliable measure, but nonetheless government statisticians think the falling crime of recent years may be on the turn, even if the headline figure could be too high.
A large part of that volume increase in violence especially is due to improved recording rather than a genuine rise in crime. However, having said that, there are some categories of violence at the more serious end of the spectrum, such as murder, attempted murder, knife crime and gun crime, where we think the rises are genuine and reflect an uptick in violent crime.
Ministers concede that there have been increases in some crimes, but don't agree that it could be because of austerity or cuts to police budgets.
I absolutely refuse to accept that there are economic reasons underpinning this. When it comes to funding, which I know people are concerned about, the facts are these. We are investing around £8.5 billion worth of public money, taxpayers' money, into policing this year.
For more than 2 decades, crime has basically been falling, but now police forces are having to face the real possibility that certain crimes are on the rise again. And that includes burglary of people's homes. Up here in East London, up 6% across England and Wales. So what are officers doing about it?
First thing is we tackle those who we know are causing the most harm, so that's our prolific burglars. The second thing is around our crime prevention piece, so we would encourage people to do the basics around crime prevention. So things like locking doors and windows at night is so important.
So start with your right hand first.
Crime figures aren't easy to interpret. A separate survey of people's personal experiences still suggests crime overall is falling. But the government's own statisticians think that may be out of date and that at least some crimes are likely to be creeping up again.
It's a confusing picture, isn't it, Daniel? Because you mentioned just at the end there this other survey which suggests that crime might be going down. But as far as the people you've been talking to are concerned, the government statisticians, it's on the rise.
Yeah, the crime survey, which measures people's experiences of crime, which still suggests crime is falling, is very, very good for measuring long-term trends. And it has shown this extraordinary fall in crime for more than 20 years. And it's very good at showing that whatever little changes there are across that time, crime has genuinely fallen in terms of what the crime that people experience. The problem is that the crime survey tends to lag behind slightly actual changes. So for a while, as we've seen these rises in particularly violent crime, but also now crimes like domestic burglary, there's been a question about are those real rises or is it just like a little glitch? But the statisticians are now pretty convinced that the crime survey is lagging slightly and is likely also to show that some violent crimes and some crimes like domestic burglary might also genuinely be on the rise.
And we heard the government minister insisting that austerity and drop in police numbers has nothing to do with it. Is he right? I mean, has anyone got any clear idea why crime is rising?
I mean, I think people write doctoral theses on why crime goes up and down. Of course, there are changes in society that change that. Frankly, just trends. People do something for a few years and then they stop. And so crime can change for all sorts of reasons. But the government do have a real difficulty because this comes at the moment where police numbers fall to the lowest they've been since 1985. And it's allowed both the opposition parties and, of course, the Police Federation that represents rank and file police officers to say you've let police numbers go too low and that's why crime is rising. I don't think it's possible to say whether or not that's true, but it's certainly given them ammunition.
Okay, Daniel, thank you.
Now, the largest rise in crime for a decade has been recorded in England and Wales, with the biggest increase in violent and sexual crime. This, as the Home Office revealed police numbers are at their lowest since 1985. Our North of England correspondent Kieran Jenkins reports from Liverpool.
Rush hour in Liverpool. Look carefully, a gunman shoots at the car and runs away. One of 50 firearm offences already here this year, as the overall crime figures for last year are released and make disturbing reading. Now, recorded crime is up on Merseyside. It has risen right across England and Wales. In fact, there are significant increases on almost every measure. Not good news for a government still under continuing pressure over cuts to police numbers. The latest figures show recorded offences up 10% to almost 5 million. Firearm offences are up 23%. Violent crime is up 18%. Knife crime up 20%. It was also revealed that police numbers have been cut again and are now at their lowest level since 1985.
We hate to say we told you so, but we did. We said if you're going to cut the number of police resources to the extent that they've been cut, 21,500 fewer officers, you're going to see a rise in crime, and that's exactly what this shows.
This kind of scaremongering does nobody any good.
Those cuts began when Theresa May was Home Secretary, and today the government continue to insist that crime is falling. If you look at the crime survey, which tends not to reflect more serious crimes, rather than offences actually recorded by the police.
Crime is falling, but crime is changing, and what we're determined to do is stay completely on top of it. Within that, I'm not ducking this in any way, is some evidence that clearly there is some genuine growth, for example, in violent crime in some areas of the country, and that we've got to stay absolutely on top of that.
At the end of the day, the police want to do their job protecting all of us, and their concern is without the numbers, without the resources, they can't do that.
The government claims there is no link between police numbers and recorded crime. Their critics say the biggest increase in a decade rather speaks for itself. Kieran Jenkins, Channel 4 News, Liverpool.
Well, speaking of crime and punishment, there were two noteworthy, to say the least, statistics concerning the state of law and order in England and Wales today. A record rise in crime, especially violent crime, and police numbers at their lowest in 3 decades. It is the most dramatic rise in recorded crime for 10 years. Nearly 5 million crimes, that is 1 every 6 seconds, with crimes of violence up by nearly a fifth. It's an alarming picture for any government, but especially perhaps for the Conservatives, who like to be seen as the traditional party of law and order.
It's the largest annual rise in crimes recorded by the police for a decade. Reported violence, knife and gun crime have all risen dramatically. While better recording of offences is driving this increase, in some areas the number of actual crimes being committed is also going up.
This is where they got in.
Thousands of pounds worth of computers and games were stolen from this youth project in Bolton last month. It has been reported to the police, but no one's come to investigate.
If I'm ringing up, I'm in a centre that provides activities for young deprived people, and I'm ringing the police and nobody's turning up. What does that say if I'm an elderly old man, you know, in my house ringing up because someone... Is that the case right across the board? Because it's frightening if it is. It really, really is.
The number of reported crimes rose 10% to almost 5 million last year. After falling to a 25-year low 3 years ago, total recorded crime has been rising. While police numbers that peaked in 2009 have fallen fairly consistently, dropping to 123,000, almost 15% lower than 8 years ago. The government says police numbers and crime are not directly linked. The Police Federation disagree.
The public won't be hoodwinked on this. They understand that if the police officers aren't there to deter, to provide reassurance and to deal with the crime, then consequently it's going to go up.
Now, the National Crime Survey, which includes crimes not reported to the police, has showed a broader picture of crime falling by 7%. But the Crime Survey doesn't include as wide a range of crimes as the police numbers, and the government admits some crimes are rising.
Within those numbers, are there some worrying signs, which we accept quite clearly, that we're seeing some increases in worrying crime, such as violent crime, in some areas of the country. And crime is falling, but crime is changing.
Labour say they would reverse the cuts in capital gains tax to raise the money it would take to recruit 10,000 extra police officers.
You would think these figures would have been the easiest of open goals for Labour, but not for the first time. It wasn't as simple as that when the Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott tackled the subject in an interview with ITV News earlier, and Carl is here to talk about it. Carl, maybe we just begin with what happened.
Well, what happened was that Diane Abbott has once again got in a muddle about her own policy on police numbers. This is what happened when our producer asked her what Labour's policy was on police numbers.
Well, what we've said is we would find the money to recruit the 10,000 police people by we would find the money because we'd look at capital gains tax. The Tories have cut capital gains tax and we want to restore it. And that would give us, I think, 170... We would find the money by restoring levels of capital gains tax.
And that's an extra 300 million a year?
We think that by restoring the cuts in capital gains tax, that would find us another £300 million a year.
Carl, we can all have a bad day at the office. Sometimes one doesn't want to make too much of these things, but it's not good, really, is it?
No, I mean, goodness knows we all make mistakes. Politicians do too. Boris Johnson famously got himself into one of these messes when he was asked about justice measures in the Queen's speech. But I do think this is different for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, this is Diane Abbott's own policy area. Secondly, she famously made a mess during the general election of these exact same figures, and she received all sorts of nasty abuse for it afterwards. That time, she eventually said it had been down to her diabetes. Now, this evening, Diane Abbott told News at 10 that her health had not been an issue today, and she didn't actually offer an explanation for what happened. So I think we're left in a situation where Diane Abbott, who has achieved a lot in politics and certainly does not deserve deserve the nasty racist and misogynistic abuse that she gets, does not look like she's a shadow Home Secretary who's on top of her own brief.
OK, Carl, thank you very much. And Diana Abbott has put out a Facebook post responding to this if you want to look at it. Sorry, not Facebook, Twitter. Easily confused.